Today, we're diving into one of the most tangled and persistent rivalries on the world stage, the relationship between the United States and Iran. You see it in the headlines all the time, right? But the real story, the why behind all the tension, is buried in decades of history. So let's dig in.
And that really brings us to the central question we're going to tackle. Are these two nations on an unavoidable collision course? With tensions as high as they are right now, figuring out how we even got here is more important than ever.
Because to really make sense of the standoff we see today, all the talk about sanctions, proxy fights, and really heated language, we've got to go back. We have to rewind the clock, because the roots of this thing go deep.
So first up, let's look at the history of mistrust. This is not some new problem that just popped up. Nope. This is a conflict that's been built, piece by piece, on a foundation of grievances and huge historical moments that are still making waves today.
This timeline really shows you how one event just stacks on top of the other. It all kind of kicks off in 1953 with the CIA-backed coup that overthrew Iran's elected prime minister. The goal was to protect Western oil interests, but it planted these seeds of deep resentment. Well, those seeds exploded in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. And right after that, you get the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis, which just poisoned relations for an entire generation. Fast forward to 2002, the axis of evil speech hardens everyone's positions. But then, in 2015, we get this brief moment of hope with the JCPOA, you know it as the Iran nuclear deal. But that door slammed shut in 2018 when the U.S. pulled out, which brings us right back to the intense situation we have today.
And that term, the Great Satan, which came out of the 1979 revolution, that tells you everything. It wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was tapping into decades of real frustration over what many Iranians saw as American meddling. It basically became a core part of the new government's identity.
Okay, so how does all that history actually affect things right now? Well, it plays out in a few key areas, and they are all pretty contentious.
And right at the heart of it all is the nuclear issue, specifically that deal we mentioned, the JCPOA. The bargain was, on paper, pretty straightforward. Iran agrees to seriously limit its nuclear program, and in exchange, all those crippling economic sanctions get lifted. For a moment there, it was hailed as this huge win for diplomacy.
But this is where we are now. Just look at these two columns. It's like two different worlds. The U.S. position, especially after 2018, was that the deal was just too weak. It didn't do anything about Iran's ballistic missiles or its growing influence in the Middle East, so the strategy became maximum pressure. Hit them with sanctions to force a better, tougher deal. Now, from Iran's point of view, it's way simpler. The U.S. signed a deal and then just walked away. They see the sanctions not as a negotiating tactic, but as illegal economic warfare, and they insist their nuclear program is only for peaceful energy. You see, they're looking at the exact same situation and seeing two completely different realities.
So beyond the nuclear standoff, the conflict is also playing out on what's called a proxy battleground. This isn't a direct war. It's more like a chess match across the entire Middle East. The U.S. and Iran compete for influence by backing opposite sides in local conflicts. You see it in Yemen, in Syria. It's a kind of shadow war that has made the whole region incredibly unstable.
This brings us to a really important point. Why should any of this matter to the rest of us? I mean, it's a regional conflict, right? Well, what's at stake is absolutely enormous, with consequences that would be felt all over the globe.
Let's just talk money and energy for a second. Look at this number. 20%. That's how much of the entire world's oil supply passes through a tiny little waterway called the Strait of Hormuz, which is right on Iran's doorstep. Any conflict there would send an absolute shockwave through the global economy, and you'd feel it at the gas pump almost immediately.
And believe me, the ripple effects would go way beyond energy prices. A direct conflict could easily spiral into a much wider, devastating regional war. It would cause massive disruptions to global shipping and trade, create a terrible humanitarian crisis, and honestly, the consequences are so big they're kind of impossible to fully predict.
So, all of that leads us to our final section here, the very uncertain future. When you look at all this history and see the incredibly high stakes, you have to ask, where does this go from here? And broadly speaking, it seems like there are two main paths. And you can see those two diverging paths laid out right here. One is the path of diplomacy. Now, this is the hard road, right? It means tough negotiations, compromises from both sides, and maybe finding a way back to an agreement like the nuclear deal. The other path, that's confrontation. It means more sanctions, more covert operations, and always running the dangerous risk that one little mistake, one miscalculation, could spiral into a full-blown war.
Which leaves us right here with this final, massive question. After everything we've looked at, the coup, the revolution, the broken deals, the proxy wars, can all these decades of bitterness and hostility actually be overcome through diplomacy? Or has too much damage been done? Is some kind of conflict at this point just inevitable? That's the heavy question that leaders are wrestling with at this very moment.